What's going on, everybody? Kalipa's Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, I'm going to be giving you some of my favorite and least favorite things about the TCL 30XL. Now before we go any further, as always, I do want to remind you to hit that subscribe button, and if you want to learn more about this phone, I will be linking to several other videos about it in the description, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and my favorite accessories for it. But with that being said, let's get into it. So my first pro for the TCL 30XL is that it has stereo audio. Now this is actually not something you see every day in a phone in this price range, and having stereo audio is going to give you a much more immersive experience when you're consuming content. Now in case you don't know what this means, when a phone has stereo audio, the sound is going to come out of not only the main speaker, but also the earpiece as well. So again, you're going to get a much more immersive experience. Now I know in this day and age, most people are usually just going to be using headphones or a speaker, but all the same, it's always nice to get good sound quality out of your actual phone speaker itself, and it gives you a little bit more flexibility in the way you're able to consume content. And like I said, most phones in this price range, and for that matter, a lot of phones even more expensive than this, for whatever reason, don't have stereo audio. So seeing it in this phone is definitely a nice thing. And in case you're wondering, here's a quick sample of what the phone speakers actually sound like. So I'm not completely sure how well the microphone actually picked that up, but in case you couldn't tell, the audio quality is actually pretty good. Now of course, keep in mind this is a phone speaker after all, so it really can only be so good. And if you're really seriously consuming a lot of content, it's not going to be anywhere near the quality of like headphones or a speaker or something like that. But again, in general, for just a regular phone speaker, especially for a more entry-level phone, it definitely does sound at least acceptable. My second pro for the TCL 30XL is the camera. Now to give you a quick rundown of the camera setup here, in the front we got a water drop notch for the front-facing camera. This camera is 13 megapixels. Then on the back, we got a quad camera setup with a 50 megapixel main camera, a 5 megapixel ultra wide camera, a 2 megapixel macro camera, and a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera. So in general, as far as features go, this phone has pretty much everything, including an ultra wide camera and a macro camera. And while having all these features is definitely not that uncommon, not every entry level phone is going to have an ultra wide camera or a macro camera. Sometimes they'll have one or the other, but having both is a little bit less common. And in addition to having all these features, the photo quality itself is actually pretty good as well. Now keep in mind, it's not going to be anywhere near the level of a flagship phone, for example, or really even a mid-range phone like the Samsung Galaxy A53 5G, but for just being a really entry-level phone, the photos it takes are going to be pretty good. So if you're taking a lot of photos and you want a wider variety of features, maybe you're taking pictures for social media, for example, in a situation like that where you want to take nice photos, but your needs are still a little bit more basic, the TCL 30XL will definitely get the job done. My third pro for the TCL 30XL is the overall design. Now on one hand, this phone doesn't have the most unique, premium looking design out there, but I definitely do think it looks nice. Despite the water drop notch and the thicker bottom bezel, the phone does have a nice sleek modern look. With the 90% screen to body ratio, we are really getting mostly screen here. So if you're consuming a lot of content, that's definitely going to be a nice thing. The bezels aren't going to be distracting or anything. And in general, the phone has a nice sleek look despite being on the larger side, so it's not going to be too bulky in your pocket. And the other thing I really like about this phone is despite not having really premium materials or anything and being made entirely of plastic, the plastic is really good quality. It doesn't feel cheap at all. The buttons are really sturdy, so you can tell the phone has good build quality. And for being a really affordable entry-level phone, it does have a nice amount of weight to it. So if you are looking for a more affordable phone, but you want a higher quality design that doesn't really feel cheap, then I'm sure you will like the design of this phone. My fourth pro for the TCL 30XL is the battery. With this phone, we're getting a 5000 mAh battery that supports 18 watt fast charging, so definitely some great battery specs here. First of all, with a 5000 mAh battery, you can expect to get really good battery life and longevity. So if you have more of a mobile lifestyle and you're not always around a charger, this is definitely going to be a great thing, because even if you're using your phone quite a bit, I would say it's most likely going to last you at least throughout the day, if not more. In addition to this, with 18 watt fast charging, while it's not the best fast charging in the world, for an entry level phone it's definitely really good. So if you have a good fast charger, the charging speeds on this phone will be good, and that's going to save you a bit of time. And in addition to this, since this phone does have a larger battery, down the road as it degrades, which all batteries do, you're not going to notice it nearly as quickly as you would with a smaller battery. So if you like to get one phone and keep it for a long time without replacing it, then a phone like this with a really large battery is going to be a great choice. And my fifth pro for the TCL 30XL is the large display. Now when it comes to this display, I do have a couple complaints about it overall, but the size is definitely not one of them. With this phone, we're getting a 6.82-inch LCD display with a 720p resolution, a PPI of 270, an aspect ratio of 20.5:9, and like I said before, a 90% screen to body ratio. So at 6.82 inches, this display is definitely on the larger side. In fact, compared to pretty much all the other phones on the market, including flagship phones like the Samsung Galaxy S22 Ultra and the iPhone 14 Pro Max, the TCL 30 XL is still definitely one of the largest phones out there, and when it comes to display size, you're really not going to get a whole lot larger than this. So if you're consuming a lot of content like watching videos, looking at photos, even reading, this is definitely going to be a great thing. And again, another cool thing about this phone in particular is that despite the display being so large, it does have a decently slim design, so overall you're going to get the benefits of having a larger display, but the phone is also not going to be too bulky to be comfortable carrying in your pocket and holding in your hand. In addition to the size, with a 20.5:9 aspect ratio, we're getting a pretty tall and narrow form factor, so if you're doing something like watching a video in landscape mode, for example, you're going to get a much more immersive experience. And if you're doing something like reading an article or scrolling through social media, you'll be able to fit more content on the screen without having to scroll as much. So overall, despite this not being the best quality display in the world, the size and dimensions really do make up for this. So if you're consuming a lot of content, this phone will be a solid choice. But now that we've gone over some of the good things about it, let's go over some potential drawbacks. So my first con for the TCL 30 XL is the storage really isn't the best. With this phone, we're getting 64GB of internal storage with microSD card expansion, so on one hand, it's at least acceptable, especially for really light users. If you don't have a lot of apps or anything like that, you're probably at least gonna get by, especially with the microSD card expansion, because that allows you to offload stuff like photos and videos. So if you just have a bunch of photos and videos and media and stuff, that's really not gonna be a problem. But on the other hand, if you're more of a power user and you have a lot of apps, keep in mind in this day and age, even the really simple apps like Reddit, for example, still take up a decent amount of space. So if you have a lot of them, while 64GB isn't really a small amount of storage per se, the more apps you have, the faster it's gonna fill up. And the other thing to keep in mind is that there are a lot of phones that are a little bit more expensive than this that have 128GB of internal storage instead. So this phone is really at that awkward price point where it's not the lowest of the low, but it's not quite a mid-range phone either. So when it comes to stuff like storage, if that is more of an important factor for you, then there are gonna be much better options out there. But that being said, if you're not really that much of a power user, if you don't have a lot of apps and stuff like that, and you really just have stuff like photos and videos that you can easily just put on a microSD card, the TCL 30 XL, while not having the ideal storage, is still going to be at least okay. My second con for the TCL 30 XL is there's no 5G connectivity. Now in this day and age, 5G connectivity isn't really absolutely necessary, but in my opinion, if you're going out of your way to get a new phone at this point, you might as well get a 5G phone, because the 5G network, after all, is really only going to expand from here. And with a 5G phone, you get access to the latest and greatest technology, and honestly, while maybe a couple years ago, 5G phones would be a lot more expensive, that's really not the case anymore. Sure, at this price point, there are really only a handful of 5G phones that are around this price, but all the same, they still are out there. Like for example, the Samsung Galaxy A13 5G, you can pick that phone up for barely more than this phone. And there are lots of other options too, depending on your carrier. So in general, considering the current price of this phone, it is really too bad that we don't get 5G connectivity here. My third con for the TCL 30 XL is the 720p display. So going back to the display, like I said before, this phone does have a resolution of 720p, and while it doesn't really look bad for what it is, it would have been a lot better with a 1080p resolution, especially considering the size and dimensions. If this were a 1080p display, it would pretty much be the ultimate entry-level phone for content consumption, because pretty much everything else about it is great. But unfortunately, we're only getting 720p here, and because of this, if you are consuming a lot of content and that's primarily what you're going to be doing with your phone, there are still going to be a couple better options out there. My fourth con for the TCL 30 XL is there's no NFC. So with this phone, unfortunately, since it doesn't have NFC, you're not going to be able to use tap and pay. And in this day and age, contactless mobile payment services are becoming more and more widely used. So at this point, I feel like pretty much every phone should have NFC, because it's really becoming a common basic feature. Sure, like the 5G connectivity, a few years ago, NFC was definitely more of a flagship feature, but nowadays you see so many other phones have it. In fact, lots of phones in this very price range even have it. So considering that, I definitely do think it's a bit of a drawback that this phone doesn't have NFC. But that being said, not everyone uses it, of course. So if you don't really care about tap and pay, then this is really not going to be a problem for you at all. Now my fifth and final con for the TCL 30 XL is the processor. With this phone, we're getting 6GB of RAM with the MediaTek Helio A25 processor. Now I will give credit where credit is due. 6GB of RAM for a phone like this is definitely a lot, and while this isn't going to be a huge difference, RAM isn't everything after all. Getting 6GB of RAM instead of the typical 3 or 4 you're usually going to find in a phone in this price range is definitely something I can appreciate. But that being said, with the MediaTek Helio A25, this is really not the fastest processor out there, and if you're doing higher performance activities like mobile gaming, or even simply just using a social media platform like Instagram or TikTok a lot, you're not going to get the best experience with this phone. So really, if you're going to be on your phone a lot, definitely keep this in mind, because again, this is really not the fastest phone out there, and depending on what your current current devices, I'd have a hard time believing this phone is really going to be a performance upgrade for many people. But that being said, I did run a Geekbench 5 benchmark test on it, and it came back with a single core score of 156 and a multi-core score of 885. So again, I really don't think this phone is going to be that much of an upgrade for many people. Sure, if you're coming from something that's a lot lower end than this, then it might be a little, but even the difference from a really low end entry level phone and more of an upper entry level phone like this is really not going to be that much. So definitely keep that in mind. But that being said, I do recommend running this test on your current phone and comparing your results to these, and that's going to give you a better idea of whether or not this phone is an upgrade for you. Because if you have more of an entry level phone and you haven't upgraded for a while, then while this phone again still really isn't that fast, if you're coming from something a little bit older and lower end, then it could still be an upgrade for you. But again, in general, this phone is really meant for more basic activities like texting, making calls, occasional web browsing, and light social media use, and then streaming stuff like videos and music. But keep in mind, again, if you're doing higher performance activities like mobile gaming, or you're just going to be on your phone a lot, there definitely are better options out there. But that being said, I have used this phone a decent amount since I got it, and I personally haven't had any performance issues, so in general, sure, it's not that fast, but as long as you're using it for its intended purpose, you will get a decent experience here. But those were my pros and cons for the TCL 30XL. In general, if you're looking for an entry-level phone with a large display, a great battery, a pretty good camera setup, and really good build quality overall, the TCL 30XL is definitely worth considering. Now again, if you want to learn more about this phone, I will be linking to several other videos about it in the description, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and my favorite accessories for it, so definitely check that out too. But that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it and found it useful, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to follow Kalipus Tech on Twitter and Instagram, and as always, I will see you in the next video.